There are moments in the life of a family when a single sentence can change everything. Not a shout, not an argument, just a few quiet words written down and released to the world that settle a question people had been whispering about for almost 20 years. In February of 2022, an elderly woman sat in her home at Sandringham in the cold Norfolk countryside and put her name to a message that would do exactly that. She was 95 years old. She had ruled for 70 years, and with one carefully chosen phrase, she reached forward into a future she knew she would not live to see, and she made a decision for her son that he had never been able to make cleanly for himself. The woman was Queen Elizabeth II, the son was Charles, and the question she answered was one that had haunted the royal family since 2005. What exactly would Camilla be allowed to be called? To understand why those few words mattered so much, you have to go back, not just a few years but decades, to a time when the name Camilla was one of the most disliked names in all of Britain. To understand the ending, you first have to sit with just how unlikely that ending once seemed. For years, millions of people in Britain looked at Camilla and saw only one thing. They saw the woman who had been there in the background during the marriage of Charles and Diana. They saw the person they blamed for the tears of a princess the whole world had fallen in love with. When Diana died in a car accident in Paris in 1997, the grief that swept across the country was enormous. Flowers piled up outside the palace gates in a sea that stretched for what looked like miles. And in the middle of all that sorrow, the public feeling toward Camilla hardened into something close to hatred. She was, in the eyes of many, the other woman, the one who had caused the pain. Some newspapers called her the most hated woman in Britain, and for a long time that title did not seem like an exaggeration. So when Charles and Camilla finally married in 2005, 8 years after Diana's death, the palace had a serious problem on its hands. The public was not ready to see Camilla treated as a future queen. The wounds were still too raw. The memory of Diana was still too strong. And so the royal household made a careful, cautious promise designed to calm everyone down. They announced that when Charles one day became king, Camilla would not be called queen. Instead, she would take a gentler, quieter title. She would be known as Princess Consort. It sounded softer. It sounded like a step back. It seemed to say to the grieving public, do not worry, she will never truly sit in Diana's place. She will stand beside Charles, but she will not be crowned as his queen in the way tradition would normally demand. It was a promise made to soothe a nation that was still angry. But there was something interesting hidden inside the wording of that promise, a small detail that most people did not notice at the time. The palace did not say Camilla could not be queen. They said she intended to be known as Princess Consort. That one word, intend, was doing quiet work. An intention is not a law. An intention can change. A door that is described as closed but never actually locked can always be opened again later. Almost nobody was thinking about that door in 2005. The mood of the moment was clear, and the mood was not kind to Camilla. She married Charles in a small ceremony, not the grand cathedral wedding a future king might normally expect. She stepped into her new role quietly, and she chose a title that deliberately avoided the ghost of Diana. Because Diana had been the Princess of Wales, and that name belonged to her in the hearts of the people, Camilla did not take it, even though she was technically entitled to. Instead, she chose to be known as the Duchess of Cornwall. It was a smaller name, a quieter name, a name that tried not to step on painful memories. And then something happened that very few people expected. Slowly, year by year, the picture began to change. Camilla did not fight the public. She did not go on television to demand that people like her. She did not complain loudly about how unfairly she felt she was being treated. Instead, she did something much harder and much slower. She simply put her head down and got to work. She showed up to engagements. She supported causes. She stood beside Charles through good times and difficult ones. She took on charity work that mattered deeply to people, including support for victims of rape and sexual assault, and work to promote reading and literacy. These were not glamorous headlines. They were the steady, unshowy labor of someone determined to be judged by what she did rather than by what she had once been accused of being. The years passed. 2 years became 5. 5 became 10. 10 stretched toward 20. And in that long stretch of ordinary, patient service, the hard feelings of the public began, very gradually, to soften. People who had once refused to say her name without anger started to notice something. The woman they had hated was still there, still working, still standing by the man she loved, and never once making a fuss about her own status. There was a quiet dignity in it that even her old critics found difficult to argue with. Back in 2006, a poll had shown that only about 1 in 5 people in Britain would be happy to see Camilla as queen. That is a stunning number when you think about it. 4 out of every 5 people did not want her to have the title. If you had shown that result to anyone at the time and told them how the story would eventually end, they would have laughed. And yet, as the years rolled on, that number began to climb. The public was changing its mind, not all at once, but the way a stubborn opinion slowly bends under the weight of steady evidence. And there was one person watching all of this with more attention than anyone else. Not Charles, not the newspapers, the Queen. Queen Elizabeth had lived through the entire painful saga from the very beginning. She had watched the fairy tale of Charles and Diana bloom and then break apart in front of the whole world. She had lived through the shock of Diana's death and the enormous public grief that followed. She had seen her son marry Camilla in the cautious, careful way the family had judged necessary. And through all of it, she had done what she almost always did. She watched, she waited, and she kept her own counsel. Queen Elizabeth was famous for her patience. She rarely rushed. She rarely reacted in the heat of a moment. She let time do its slow work, and she chose her interventions with great care. By the early 2020s, the Queen was in the twilight of her extraordinary reign. She had been on the throne for nearly 70 years, longer than any monarch in British history. She was in her mid-90s. Her health, which had been remarkably strong for most of her life, was beginning to fade. She had canceled trips. She had been quietly taken to hospital for tests. Her doctors had advised her to rest and to keep to lighter duties. Everyone around her understood, even if no one said it out loud, that the long reign was moving toward its final chapter. And the Queen understood it too. She was a deeply practical woman, and she had spent her whole life thinking not just about the present, but about the future of the institution she served. She knew that when she died, her son Charles would become king. And she knew that the moment he did, the old question about Camilla would come roaring back to the surface. What would Camilla be called? Would she be queen? Would she be that softer princess consort the family had promised back in 2005? Would there be arguments? Would there be division? Would the transition of the crown, already a heavy and emotional moment, be tangled up in a fresh public fight about a title? The Queen did not want that. She had spent 70 years protecting the smooth working of the monarchy. The very last thing she wanted was for her death to be followed by confusion and quarreling about her daughter-in-law's name. And so, as she looked ahead to a milestone that was approaching, she saw an opportunity to settle the matter herself, cleanly, and with all the weight of her own personal authority behind it. That milestone was her accession day. On the 6th of February in 2022, the Queen would mark 70 years since the day she became monarch. It was a platinum jubilee, a length of reign no British king or queen had ever reached before. It was a moment of celebration, a moment when the whole nation would be looking toward her with affection and respect. And it was, she decided, the perfect moment to say something she had perhaps been thinking about for a very long time. So on the eve of that anniversary, a message was released in her name. It was warm. It was reflective. It looked back over the decades of change she had witnessed. And then, near its heart, it turned toward the future and toward her son, and toward the woman standing beside him. She wrote that when the time came for Charles to become king, she knew the people would give him the same loyal support they had always given her. And then came the sentence that changed everything. She wrote that it was her sincere wish that, when that time came, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort as she continued her own loyal service. Queen Consort, not Princess Consort, Queen. With those words, the door that had been left quietly unlocked back in 2005 was pushed wide open, and it was the Queen herself who pushed it. This was not a palace spokesperson making an announcement. This was not a newspaper reporting a rumor. This was the personal, direct wish of the sovereign herself, the most respected woman in the country, spoken in her own voice on one of the most important days of her reign. And she had chosen her words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much they weighed. A sincere wish from the Queen was not a casual comment. It was as close to a command as such a message could be without actually being a law. The effect was immediate and profound. For 17 years, the question of Camilla's future title had hung over the family like an unfinished piece of business, a loose thread that everyone could see but nobody wanted to pull. And now, in a single carefully written sentence, the Queen had tied it off. She had reached out with all her authority and settled a matter that her son had never been able to settle for himself, because for Charles to declare his own wife a future queen would have looked like ambition and pride. But for his mother to declare it, out of love and out of a wish to protect the family's future, was something else entirely. It was a gift. It was a blessing. And it was, in its own quiet way, one of the most important decisions of the final part of her long life. Those who understood the monarchy grasped at once what had just happened. One former royal correspondent described it as the most extraordinary message, and said that the Queen was doing everything she could to make sure the transition to her son as king would be as smooth and free of trouble as possible. That was the whole point. The Queen was thinking, as she almost always did, about the institution that would outlive her. She was clearing obstacles from the path her son would one day walk. She was making sure that, when the terrible day of her death arrived, there would be one less thing to argue about, one less wound to reopen, one less reason for division at a moment when the family and the country would need unity most of all. And there was something deeply human beneath all the constitutional weight of it. Here was a mother, near the end of her life, publicly embracing the woman her son loved. Here was a queen who had watched Camilla endure years of hostility, quietly earn back the respect of a nation, and stand faithfully by Charles through it all. And in giving her that blessing, Elizabeth was saying something to the whole country. She was saying that she, personally, had judged Camilla and found her worthy. She was saying that the long, patient years of service had been seen, and had been counted, and had earned their reward. Coming from a woman famous for her caution and her reluctance to reveal her private feelings, it was an extraordinarily generous thing to do. What made it even more poignant was something that, at the time, no one could have known for certain, though many perhaps feared it. This wish, this blessing, this final settling of the question would turn out to be one of the last great acts of Queen Elizabeth's reign. The time she spoke of, the time when Charles would become king, was closer than anyone wanted to believe. And that is where this story turns next, from a wish written on paper to the moment that wish was suddenly, painfully, put to the test. The message about Camilla had been sent out into the world in February. It had been received, discussed, praised, and quietly absorbed into the national conversation. And then, for a while, life carried on. The Platinum Jubilee celebrations came, filling the summer with parties and parades and street gatherings up and down the country. Queen Elizabeth appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to enormous crowds. It was a season of gratitude and affection, a nation saying thank you to a woman who had given it 70 years of steady service. But behind the celebrations, those close to the Queen could see that her strength was fading. She had promised in her accession message that she would continue to serve, and she meant it, but her public appearances grew fewer and shorter. She leaned more heavily on a walking stick. She missed events she would once have attended without a second thought. The woman who had been a fixed point in British life for as long as most people could remember was, at last, growing frail. And then, in September of that same year, only 7 months after she had written her wish for Camilla, Queen Elizabeth II died at her beloved home in Scotland, at Balmoral. She was 96 years old, and in the instant of her passing, the future she had been planning for so carefully arrived all at once. The moment a monarch dies, everything changes in a heartbeat, without ceremony, without pause, without any need for an announcement. Under the ancient rules of the British Crown, there is no gap, no empty throne, no waiting period. The old sovereign dies and the new sovereign becomes king or queen in the very same instant. So at the exact moment Elizabeth's long life ended, her son Charles stopped being a prince and became King Charles III. There was no election. There was no ceremony required to make it so. It simply happened automatically, the way it always has. And in that same instant, something else happened too, something quieter but no less immediate. Under the old common law of England, the wife of a king becomes queen automatically, without any need for a separate decision. So at the moment Charles became king, Camilla, in strict legal terms, became queen, not because anyone declared it in that moment, not because of a ceremony, but simply because that is how the law had always worked. The wife of the king is the queen. It happened the way a shadow follows a shape, instantly and without discussion. But law and public feeling are two different things, and this is where the Queen's careful planning from 7 months earlier suddenly mattered enormously. Because although the law made Camilla queen in that instant, the country still needed to know what she would actually be called. And here, in a moment of grief and shock, the ground held firm precisely because Elizabeth had prepared it. There was no scramble. There was no confusion. There was no ugly public argument breaking out in the middle of the national mourning. The question had already been answered. The Queen herself had answered it in February. Her sincere wish was known to everyone. And so, in the days that followed her death, Camilla stepped into a new title that had, in a sense, already been given to her by the woman who had just died. She became known as the Queen Consort. That word, consort, was doing something very specific and very deliberate in those first days and weeks. It was there for a reason that had everything to do with respect and timing. The country had just lost Queen Elizabeth. For 70 years, the words the Queen had meant one woman and one woman only. To suddenly start calling Camilla simply the Queen, in the raw days right after Elizabeth's death, would have felt wrong to a great many people. It would have felt too fast, too much like erasing the woman they were mourning. So the title Queen Consort served as a gentle bridge. It made clear that Camilla was queen by marriage, the wife of the reigning king, while carefully keeping her distinct from the beloved Elizabeth, whose loss the nation was still weeping over. It was a title of respect in two directions at once, honoring Camilla's new position while honoring the memory of the great queen who had just passed. And this is one of the quiet subtleties of the whole story that many people never fully understood. The word consort was never really a permanent part of Camilla's title in the deep traditional sense. Royal historians who studied how the wives of past kings had been styled found something interesting. Queens who came before, women like Alexandra and Mary, and the Queen Mother who had also been named Elizabeth, were very rarely called consort in everyday life. They were simply called queen, followed by their name. The word consort tended to appear only in the most formal of settings, in coronation services and in official prayers, not in ordinary daily use. So the historians were not surprised to see consort attached to Camilla in those early months. They understood it for what it was, a temporary and respectful arrangement, suited to a moment of mourning, rather than a permanent label meant to mark Camilla out as somehow lesser forever. But of course, the public did not always follow the fine points of royal history. To many ordinary people watching, Queen Consort simply became the name they knew Camilla by. It appeared in news reports. It appeared on official documents. It became the phrase people used. And for a while, through the autumn and winter following Elizabeth's death, that is who Camilla was, the Queen Consort, the wife of the new king, carrying a title that had been personally blessed by the old queen in one of her final acts. It is worth pausing to think about what this moment meant for Camilla herself, as a person. For 17 years she had lived under the shadow of that cautious 2005 promise, the one that said she would only ever be a princess consort, a softer and smaller thing. For decades before that, she had lived under the shadow of public dislike, of being blamed, of being seen as the villain in a tragic story. And now, in the space of a single day, following the death of a woman who had come to respect and value her, she had become queen. Not a princess consort, a queen, the very title the country had once sworn she would never hold. But she did not celebrate it loudly. That was not her way, and it would have been deeply inappropriate given the circumstances. She had just lost her mother-in-law, a woman she had grown close to. Her husband had just lost his mother. The country was in mourning, and so Camilla did what she had always done. She stepped forward quietly, took up her new duties, and continued the steady work that had slowly won her the nation's respect in the first place. There was no gloating. There was no sense of a woman finally seizing a prize. There was only the familiar picture of Camilla, dressed in black, standing beside her grieving husband, supporting him through the hardest days of his life, just as she had supported him through so much before. And the public remarkably largely accepted it. This was perhaps the greatest sign of just how much things had changed. The woman who, in 2006, only 1 in 5 people had wanted as queen, was now stepping into that exact role, and the country was not rising up in anger. There were no mass protests. There was no wave of fury like the one that had once surrounded her. The long years of patient service and the Queen's own personal blessing had done their work. The ground had shifted so completely that what would once have been unthinkable now felt, to most people, almost natural. Part of the reason for that acceptance was the simple genius of the Queen's timing. By making her wish public in February, months before her death, Elizabeth had given the country time to get used to the idea while she was still alive. People had heard the phrase Queen Consort attached to Camilla back in the spring, in a moment of celebration rather than grief. They had already begun, quietly, to absorb it. So when the moment actually arrived in September, it did not come as a shock. The Queen had, in effect, prepared the nation for the future while she was still here to steady it. She had used her own authority and her own popularity, at the height of her jubilee, to smooth the path for a decision she knew would be difficult. It was, when you really look at it, a masterclass in the quiet art of managing an institution through change. Yet even as Camilla settled into life as Queen Consort, that word consort still sat there, attached to her name, a small reminder of the caution and the compromise of the past. It was a bridge built for a moment of mourning, and bridges, by their nature, are meant to be crossed. The question that now hung in the air, unspoken but present, was simple. Would that word stay forever? Or would there come a moment when it, too, would quietly be set aside, completing the long journey that had begun in hostility and had traveled, year by year, toward acceptance? The answer would come with the next great royal event, an event that had not happened in Britain for 70 years, an event that would place a crown on Camilla's head in front of the watching world. And in the small details of that day, in a single word left off an invitation, the final chapter of this remarkable story would quietly be written. A coronation is one of the rarest and most solemn events in British life. Because monarchs reign for so long, most people live their entire lives seeing only one, or perhaps none at all. Queen Elizabeth had been crowned in 1953, and for the 70 years that followed, no one in Britain had witnessed the ceremony that formally sets the crown upon a sovereign's head. So when it was announced that King Charles III would be crowned in May of 2023 at Westminster Abbey, the ancient church where these ceremonies have taken place for 1,000 years, the whole country understood that it was about to see something it might never see again. And there was a second, quieter announcement folded inside the first. Charles would not be crowned alone. Beside him, in the same ceremony, Camilla would be crowned too. She would not simply stand and watch her husband receive the crown. She would kneel and receive one of her own. For the woman who had once been the most disliked figure in the country, this was a moment of almost unimaginable transformation. She was to be a crowned and anointed queen, blessed in the most sacred royal ceremony the nation possesses. But before the ceremony itself, there came a small and seemingly ordinary thing that royal watchers seized upon immediately, because they understood that in the world of the monarchy, small things are never really small. In the early spring of 2023, Buckingham Palace released the official invitation to the coronation. It was a beautiful object, printed with gold detailing and decorated with symbols of British folklore and the natural world, including an old figure from ancient legend representing spring and rebirth. Thousands of these invitations would be sent out to guests from around the globe, and when people looked closely at the wording, they noticed something that made them catch their breath. The invitation referred to the king's wife not as the queen consort, but simply as Queen Camilla. The word consort was gone. It had been quietly, deliberately dropped. There was no grand announcement declaring the change. There was no press conference explaining it. The palace did not issue a statement trumpeting a new title. The word was simply left off, allowed to fall away as naturally as a leaf from a tree. And in that quiet absence, the final step of Camilla's long journey was taken. She was no longer the queen consort, the bridge title made for a moment of mourning. She was now, plainly and simply, Queen Camilla. To those who understood the history, this was a significant and carefully judged move. The bridge had served its purpose. The period of deepest mourning for Elizabeth had passed. Enough time had gone by that calling Camilla simply the Queen no longer felt like an insult to the memory of the woman the country had lost. And so, at what was judged to be exactly the right moment, the temporary word was retired, and the permanent title took its place. The royal family's own website began to refer to her simply as the Queen. The transformation was complete. There was a reason the timing was handled with such care, and it came back once again to public feeling. In the months leading up to the coronation, Camilla's popularity had continued to rise. The nation had watched her support Charles through the death of his mother with steadiness and grace. The old hostility had faded further still. So when the palace judged that the moment was right to drop the word consort, they were not gambling. They were reading the mood of the country, just as the Queen had done so skillfully the year before, and they had concluded that the public was now ready to accept Camilla as simply Queen, without qualification and without a softening word attached. Royal experts explained that, far from being unusual, this was actually in keeping with tradition. The wives of past kings had generally been known as Queen followed by their name, not Queen consort. So in a sense, dropping the word was not an act of ambition at all. It was a return to the normal, historic way of doing things. It brought Camilla into line with the queens who had come before her, the Alexandras and Marys and Elizabeths of earlier reigns. The word consort had been the unusual thing, born of unusual circumstances. Its removal simply restored the ordinary pattern. But experts also pointed to something deeper beneath the surface of this small change. For years, that word consort had carried a weight of meaning far heavier than its 6 letters suggested. To some, it had seemed to symbolize all the things that had once made Camilla appear, in the eyes of her critics, not quite legitimate. It seemed to whisper that she was a queen, yes, but a lesser sort of queen, a queen with an asterisk, a queen who had to be marked out as different because of the controversial road she had traveled to get there. And so the decision to remove it was read by many as a deliberate act by Charles. It was seen as his way of asserting, firmly and finally, that his wife was fully and completely queen, with no qualification, no shadow, and no reminder of old scandals hanging over her name. It was his insistence that she be seen not as the other woman of decades past, but as his queen, standing beside him as an equal partner in the way that the wives of kings had always stood. And so, on the 6th of May in 2023, the ceremony took place. Inside the vast and ancient Westminster Abbey, before a congregation of thousands and a television audience of many millions more around the world, King Charles III was crowned. And beside him, Camilla was crowned too, anointed and blessed as queen. The woman who had once been booed and blamed, the woman only a fraction of the country had wanted, now knelt in the most sacred space in British royal life and rose again as a crowned queen. It was the completion of a journey almost too dramatic to believe, a journey from being called the most hated woman in the land to wearing a crown blessed by the church and accepted by the nation. And standing invisibly behind that entire moment, present in spirit if not in body, was Queen Elizabeth II, because none of it, in truth, could have happened so smoothly without her. It was her wish, written down in February of 2022, that had settled the fundamental question and made this day possible without division. She had used the last full year of her reign to prepare the ground, to give her blessing, to clear away the obstacle that might otherwise have turned this coronation into a fresh national argument. When Charles quietly dropped the word consort, most people did not object, and a large part of the reason was that Elizabeth had already told them, in her own sincere voice, that Camilla was worthy to be queen. The old queen had reached forward from beyond her own death to make her son's most important day easier. Her fingerprints were all over the smoothness of it. There is one more piece to this story, and it is a piece that reminds us just how carefully the rules of the monarchy actually work, and how a title like this is not always guaranteed forever. Because although Camilla became a crowned queen, she is a queen by marriage, not a queen who rules in her own right. She holds her position because she is the wife of the reigning king, not because she inherited the throne herself. This is the difference between a queen who reigns like Elizabeth was and a queen who is married to a king like Camilla is. Camilla supports Charles, she carries out official duties, she serves as patron of dozens upon dozens of charities. But she does not rule. She is not the head of state, and she could never inherit the throne if Charles were to die before her. The moment that happens, the crown passes instantly to the next in line, and the next in line is Charles's elder son, William. Which means that Camilla's title, remarkably, is not hers forever in the way it might seem. Should the day come when Charles is gone and William becomes king, it would then fall to William to decide what his stepmother would be called from that point on. She would likely become known as a queen dowager, a term that means the widow of a king. Her role would change again, as royal roles so often do, shaped by the decisions of a new sovereign. It is a quiet reminder that in this ancient institution, nothing stands entirely still, and every title exists within a web of custom and law that stretches back through the centuries and forward into a future none of us can see. But that is a chapter for another day, one that has not yet been written and that everyone hopes remains far off. For now, the story that began in hostility ends in a crown. It is a story about patience, about the slow and difficult work of changing people's minds not through argument but through steady deeds. It is a story about a woman who was hated and who, over the course of nearly 2 decades, quietly earned a nation's respect. And above all, it is a story about an old queen near the end of her life, who used one of her final acts to reach out with love and wisdom, to settle a painful question, to bless the woman her son loved, and to make sure that, when her own long reign finally ended, the family and the country she had served for 70 years could move forward in peace rather than in conflict. A few quiet words, written down at Sandringham in the winter of her life. That is all it took. And with them, Queen Elizabeth shaped the future of the crown one last time and gave Camilla the title that the whole world now knows her by. Not the other woman, not the most hated woman in Britain, but Queen Camilla, crowned and accepted exactly as the old queen had sincerely wished.